Hello everyone. Welcome to the first episode of season two of the Dialexicon podcast, a channel targeted to the youth where we critically engage with leading scholars and connect philosophy to contemporary social issues, all at a digestible level for a young audience. My name is Rohan Goyal, and this week we are joined by Dr. Deepak Sharma, who is currently Professor of Indian Religions and Philosophy and the inaugural Distinguished Scholar in the Public Humanities at Case Western Reserve University, as well as the author of various publications. Hello, Dr. Sharma, and how are you today?
I'm okay. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Before we get into some of your philosophy research and some of your views, I wanted to talk about some of your background. So, could you speak to how you got into the field of philosophy, some of your academic experience before that, and maybe some of the projects you're working on now and want to do so in the future?
Sure. So my background began in kind of predictable, typical ways that I was kind of born and raised STEM, and I was enrolled in a master's in engineering at Cooper Union in New
Hmm.
York, and I was going to get a math degree from NYU. So it was a dual enrollment, and and I think that in my first year and a half when I was at NYU, I became really, what's to say, I became kind of disheartened when I was watching and observing many of the students who were pre-med. And the
Hmm.
classes were packed with kids who were pre-med and wanted to do exceptionally well and so on. And it led to all kinds of strange ethical behavior or unethical behavior. And this was a time when excuse me, students would pull the fire alarm in the dorm room, not the dorm room, the dorm, and during the night before the exam. And so you would see this really strange kind of competition, and I became kind of painfully aware of the difference between studying for the sake of studying and studying for the sake of kind of vocational dispositions. And I recall being very suspicious of it, and I recall that asking students and my peers and my parents' friends and so on why it was such a good idea to become a doctor,
Yeah.
and the answer just always revolved around money. Is that like, well, you can make a lot of money, and it wasn't even you could do something good for people or that it's a
Hmm.
noble profession. It was just really about money, and that led me to just question kind of really fundamental things about what well, can you get happiness if you have money? And I started observing things like poverty, and I started observing things like really kind of the simplest thing that money can't always buy happiness.
Hmm.
And in my observation, I became very suspicious and skeptical of the vocationally driven pre-med students that surrounded me. And then I had a kind of unfortunate experience of having a math class that was probably taught by somebody who didn't take their work very seriously and certainly didn't take me very seriously. And it might have been a grad student who told me this, but I asked him some fundamental question about math. I think I asked him, how do we know 1 + 1 = 2 or something like that. And he said to me, you don't need to know that. You're just going to be an engineer. And that really made me the most disappointed.
Right.
And had he answered that in a different way, he could have said like, "Wow, looks like you're interested in kind of philosophical stuff or theoretical stuff about math." Then I might have stayed on at NYU. And I'll make that long story very short. But eventually, I ended up transferring to a place called Reed College out in Portland, Oregon. And I'm not sure if you've heard of Reed College, but it's really driven by kind of academic excellence and the search for knowledge. And you have an option, for example, that you can get graded, but you don't have to find out your grades. And all you have to think about is these comments that your teachers give you on their paper, on the papers, right? So it's a very different model.
Hmm.
And so I joined that model thinking that this would be, an interesting way to go. I joined it thinking I would be a history major. And at that time, I was beginning to think, I was questioning everything, and that was a great place to do that. And by questioning everything, I mean that I was questioning the whole endeavor, capitalism, and so on and so forth, such that I was really suspicious of any kind of knowledge, shall we say. And one of my teachers saw that I was kind of more kind of deeply immersed in questions about whether or not things really exist independently of your mind. So, and that was brought on by all kinds of recreational sort of activities that I was engaging in. And this one teacher that I had, um, knew that I was curious about this. And then after discovering something about my background as an Indian and so on, suggested that I look at this question about whether or not things exist independently of the mind in the context of the debate between two schools of Vedanta, namely Advaita Vedanta and Dvaita Vedanta of Madhvacharya.
Mm-hmm.
And the Advaitins, of course, think that things they aren't really as you see them. All things ultimately are Brahman.
Mm-hmm.
And for Madhvacharya, things are real. So he said, look at this debate, and you'll be able to do two things at the same time. One of them is that you'll get to ask the kind of philosophically driven questions that are bothering you. And the second is you'll learn something about your background
Mm-hmm.
and your history and your forefathers and Hinduism for that matter. So that's what happened to some degree.
Yeah, I think that story truly resonates, with me and my family. Like, growing up in the Silicon Valley, we're completely surrounded by technology and that drive for STEM education. But I think one sort of point of difference is I think I've been blessed with truly a great education system in my region, where teachers do like sort of try to instill this principle of always questioning assumptions, and always coming to your own conclusions as opposed to sort of assertions that you just sort of hang on to. One question I had is, what was your exposure to Indian philosophy before this encounter in, um,
Yeah. Hardly any.
I see.
Like hardly any exposure. My parents are STEM. My dad is or was a protein crystallographer. Are you familiar with
No.
that kind of? So Watson and Crick
Yeah,
and figuring out the structure of DNA.
sure.
So my dad was involved in that kind of work, and in fact knew Crick, and he remembers giving a talk as a postdoc with Crick in the audience. So he was scientifically driven, and my mother studied zoology and is also scientifically driven. So they certainly didn't teach me anything about Hinduism per se.
I see.
And I think that the only exposure that I got, other than going to the newly constructed Hindu temple in Flushing, New York, and I went to the groundbreaking ceremony. That's how old I am. And I know the people who are doing the priestly activities when we're waiting for the priests to come. They're relatives of mine, as a matter of fact. Um, and I would go with my parents with some frequency to Carnatic music concerts.
Hmm.
And my dad was the founding secretary of the Carnatic Music Academy of North America, which also should give you an idea how old he is. And he's actually 89. And maybe in that context, I got to see a kind of bhakti. But with classical music like that, that's so technical, that bhakti, that it's hard
Hmm.
to say if it's bhakti. And nobody really taught me anything. They didn't say. And the only other than that, my exposure to Hinduism, not Indian philosophy, was Amar Chitra Katha comic books, which I'm sure you know what those are. Oh,
No,
really? Oh my God, I'm so dated, huh? That's incredible. Is that there's a there that the company called Amar Chitra Katha produced comic books about Hindu gods and goddesses. You've seen
I
those
see.
before.
Yes, Gatha meaning story, so I think
Yeah,
I'm sure I've seen these.
sure seen those. So I mean, and maybe that was what I used to think about, but that was not anything profound.
I see. Wow, like this, I was not expecting this, but this truly, reflects some of my own upbringing in a very sort of devout Hindu family. Um,
Oh,
I've interacted somewhat with sort of Hindu texts, so maybe this is sort of uh, a path from forward for me that I can investigate. Do you think, I guess, do you have any advice for other young people who are interested in Indian philosophy? Um,
sure, 100%. And I wrote a short piece about it.
okay,
And it's about risk. Okay. And this is the way I usually kind of present this and what I wrote about is that there's something very ironic, right? Is that my parents, for sure, your parents, maybe, took tremendous risk by coming to the United States or by leaving India.
yes,
Tremendous risk. And my father left India in 1963, right? So this was a very, very long time ago. Left India in 63, and he only came to the United States in 68 to NIH. And kind of classic story. I mean, it's a real story. There were not that very many Indians there at this time. He came here with like $200.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and he came to Britain with, I think, 50 pounds, right? And I mean, and he got it through some real complicated means, right? I mean, it was really complicated. He had to get money from a grant from the Maharaja of Mysore. Like it was crazy, right? I mean, it's and
Yeah.
he's written a memoir, but he
Really.
took tremendous risk to get here, tremendous, and it was also a tremendous risk for him to leave the kind of confines of his, Udupi world.
Hmm.
He grew up in Udupi, which is a very religious place, and to actually break out of this kind of religious shell, so to speak, and study, physics. Like who does this then, right? And then coming to Britain was a massive risk. What is it going to be like? And especially because it was the former colonizer,
Yeah.
right? And then he goes from there to here, right? And they meet people through random encounters, or somebody who knows somebody, and they all take care of each other. Tremendous risk. And the greatest irony is that these people who took so much risk, right? Their children take very little risk, right? What should you do? You should become an engineer, computer science, or a doctor. And those are the three things that you can become. You can't become anything else. Anything else is going to be a failure or a disappointment, right? Both for the kid and for the parents. And the greatest irony is that this position that you're in now, or that people are in now, is only because the parents took such risk. And so I encourage my Indian students to take more of a risk, right? Be risky, right? Be risky like your parents. And now that you're here, your parents are well off because you're model minority and you have such a safety cushion here, you can take more risks. You don't have to become a doctor, or you don't have to become a doctor right away. You don't have to become an engineer, or you don't have to become an engineer right away. Pursue your passion, right? Whatever. And I mean, it's in that sense, it's risky to embrace or acknowledge a passion, right? Your passion should only be one thing, studying to get it to do well on your MCATs, right? And even your passion to do volunteer work is only there because it pads your CV, right? And I can't tell you, I've been teaching at Case for 22 years now, and I've been teaching since 1998, right?
Mhm.
And I have seen so many students of Indian origin who don't want to become a doctor, or don't want to become an engineer, and they just go ahead with it, and they'll have a good life. I know they will, right? But they may not have a happy life, and they have passions that they're not going to ever pursue. And it's all because they don't want to take the risk that their parents took.
Yeah, truly. I think this is a universal sort of piece of advice that, not just applicable to certain ethnicities, obviously, but any student who finds themselves pushed to any path that they're sort of social, like society tries to make them pursue, that's, I guess, not the only way. I'm reminded of, I'm assuming you've watched Three Idiots, the movie.
Yeah, yeah,
So the same sort of message, similar message
yeah.
is certainly repeated in that movie. So we've digressed a little bit, but I think this was very important to understand, especially at the very beginning of this episode. But now to get into some of your actual work and some of your views, I want to ask a very broad question of what you view philosophy necessary to mean. I think that's a very, at least in my mind, it's obviously a very broad term that's I feel often misunderstood. So I just want to understand your takes on what necessarily that entails.
Right, that's a good question. I think that the definition of philosophy, or the semantic range of philosophy, is quite wide,
Mhm.
and some things that ought to be considered philosophical aren't, for various reasons, and some things that are philosophical probably shouldn't, right? So it's used with such a wide semantic range, right? And I think that certainly in the context of the academic study, academic in the kind of the academic world, philosophy really does refer primarily to Western sorts of reflections.
Okay.
Right. And I suggested that Indian or Chinese or what have you, other kinds of reflections are not usually regarded as philosophy unless they're forced to fit the template of what is kind of Western philosophy. So kind of Western philosophical speculation um, is I see, and this is said from a kind of the perspective of someone who's outside of it to some degree, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of Western philosophical speculation um, is began with um, some, for lack of a better phrase, dead white men and their ruminations about about how things worked in the world, some speculations about how things worked in the world, ways attempts to make sense of the world. And and of course, by the time of the Enlightenment, some of these speculations became what we understand as science,
Hmm.
or became as what we understand as psychology, right? So prior to that, you had just speculation, and those disciplines of science, physics, philosophy, religion were not relevant, right? It's only because of the Enlightenment that that taxonomy happens, right? But I think of philosophy as Western philosophy as ways to make sense of the world, right? Using
Sure.
reason and using observation. Um, and in more contemporary times, and I say this in direct contrast to Indian philosophy, is
Hmm.
that and I say this because when I have students who take Western philosophy and they take my Indian philosophy classes, they make certain kinds of errors, right? And I find that students of Western philosophy are very happy in our papers to speculate about their own beliefs, is that their opinions and beliefs matter. And if they were to write a paper, they really are trying to articulate with clarity what they believe. And in contrast, right, so I'm going to give you sort of a characterization of Indian philosophy here. In contrast, Indian philosophy is never, ever, ever about what you believe. It's
Hmm.
always about explaining what somebody else said or believes. It's always commentarial, right? So now, contemporary Indian philosophy might be a little bit more speculative, but Indian philosophy, classical Indian philosophy, is always about that is always about not speculating, is always about clarifying or defending somebody else's belief system that you adhere to, right? And so there, as I like to joke, there are no new ideas in Indian philosophy. They're only confirmation of old ones, or telling somebody else that they haven't understood it properly. There's a new way to understand this. After all, if we look at the schools of Vedanta, they share the same texts, they just interpret them differently,
Hmm.
right? And because if we think about the schools of Indian philosophy, particularly schools of Hinduism, they all claim to be based on Shruti, which is to say the Vedas, right? And the Vedas are apaurushaya, that's to say, not humanly made, and true. They're true. They can't be. They can only be explained. And anything that you see as a contradiction there is your own inability to see consistency, and your own error.
I see.
And this is a very different endeavor than we see in the Western philosophical realm,
Sure.
right? So people might be thinking about Plato or thinking about Heidegger, but nobody is treating Heidegger or Plato as if they're Shruti. They treat themselves like they're Shruti.
Yeah. Do
Does
you
that make
think,
sense?
of course, do you think this stems from the fact that Indian philosophy is ultimately shaped by religious beliefs?
Ah, so then comes another big question. Is it that Rohan is what is religion? Right? And so that said, and this is why Indian philosophical speculation has largely been excluded from Western philosophical analysis and from respect. Like there's disrespect, a lot of disrespect. Though we find Buddhism,
Hmm.
certain kinds of Buddhism being more acceptable.
Sure.
But of course, one must remember that those presentations of Buddhism have been desiccated and transformed such they would appeal to a Western audience, right? And so Western audiences and Western observers have looked into Buddhism and picked out only the things that they think are philosophy, and then celebrated those.
Okay.
Whereas in the Indian sense, or in the Indian world, I think it's partly because of the colonial history. that there's been less willingness to embrace Indian philosophy as philosophy, right? And that's I think it's more based on a kind of colonial hierarchy than it is on actual practice. Because after all, when we look at Indian philosophy, and I say this as a comparative philosopher, so my PhD is actually in comparative philosophy, and my sub field is Indian philosophy. So my PhD is in comparative philosophy of religions.
Mhm.
Is that if we look at analytic philosophy in the West, not continental philosophy, but analytic philosophy, we'll see, if you look at somebody like Quine, people like that, you'll see wonderful attempts to articulate the universe using symbolic logic,
Mhm.
right? And making and worrying about claims, right? And that a claim, so language has significant power, like a claim, and if you make a claim and you make the opposite of the claim, they can't both be held at the same time, let's say. So you can't have A and not A, right?
Mhm.
And it's possible and plausible to desiccate a lot of Indian philosophy down to very similar kind of symbolic logic and very similar kind of claims. And the whole endeavor is very similar to analytic philosophy in this way, even though the Indian philosophers are still doing commentaries on primary sources, right? And so, in a comparative sense, we can say that's where they overlap. Right
Right.
one of my PhD advisor, he used to argue that these different traditions, Western analytic philosophy, Indian philosophy, and so on, were intentionally they imagined that their arguments could be, as he called it, denaturalized. And what he meant is that taken out of context and represented in symbolic logic, and therefore would be translatable across time and cultures,
Mhm.
right? And so if you looked and saw a philosophical structure in the context of Indian philosophy, you should be able to express it in a way or articulate it in a way that you can use a language that would be understood by Western philosophers. And consequently, you could learn from those across these what appeared to be a chasm but isn't. And you can also argue with one another because he would suggest that you could translate from the Sanskrit into symbolic logic, and you could do the same thing, translate, so to speak, from English, let's say, into a symbolic logic, and then just look at how these systems compare to each other, or if there's an argument used in one that could be deployed in another, and so on.
Okay. You briefly mentioned a concept of contemporary Indian philosophy. What exactly do you mean by that, and how does that differ from classical Indian philosophy?
Oh, sure. Contemporary Indian philosophers like J.D. Krishnamurti and even Aurobindo, you could throw Aurobindo in there. They're writing for a different audience,
Okay.
and they're speculating and not tying. I mean, Aurobindo is not speculating the way that Krishnamurti did, but they're t not tying their positions into traditional or historical ones. So they're independent thinkers whose
Okay.
speculations are independent. Think of it, it's funny, sometimes I think of this in terms of agency, right?
Hmm.
And that if you buy into dharma,
Hmm.
right? Dharma, the dutiful obligation, shall we say, then you don't have any agency. You're obliged to do what your varna or your jati, your caste, your class, and your gender and your age tells you to do. And you don't also resent this. You don't have an idea of being an agent other than acting on behalf of the group. Whereas, and let me complete this. Whereas in the Western context, you always have agency. And this is highlighted, so to speak. Let me tie this together for you, Rohan, right? So this is highlighted when it comes to marriage, is that in the Indian context, in many cases, you don't have any agency to decide who you're going to marry. Whereas falling in love means, ironically, that you have agency in who you marry. But the irony is that if you fall in love, that's a belief that you've lost some of your agency in the love, right? But that said, if we tie it back to philosophical speculation,
Hmm.
Indian philosophers want you to think in relationship to the Vedas or in relationship to a primary text, right?
Hmm.
So you have the Astika traditions like Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya Yoga, and they all claim to be somehow traced to the Vedas. Whether the tracing is a mere veneer or whether it's more unpacked, or more obvious, right? Whereas you don't need to tether yourself. You don't need oh yes, this you can, I'm going to trademark this. You don't need a Vedic umbilical cord,
Okay.
right? You don't need any kind of umbilical cord, right? Which is why you have speculations about reason itself and about how all human beings can come up. Like, so you think about Kant and you think about the capacity for humans to be reasonable.
Hmm.
Whereas in the Indian context, reason is not permissible outside of the context of the Vedas,
Mm.
right? Like you still have to bow your head to the Vedas.
Yes.
You can think of that as intellectual freedom, let's say, or you can think of that as agency, right?
Mm.
Or I'll give you another example, and let me know if you're done with this, right? Is that so I told you my father listens to Carnatic music, right?
Yes.
And Carnatic and Hindustani music is improvisational, right? And Carnatic, I can't say so much about Hindustani, but Carnatic music is improvisational, but the improvisation must stay within the raga
Hmm.
completely, right?
Yes.
So when I played improvisational music to my dad, okay, which would be the Grateful Dead, let's say. Have you heard of the Grateful Dead?
No.
Oh, that's funny. You're from California?
Yes.
The Grateful Dead are the premier California band. Anyway, they're improvisational music. Okay, a more contemporary version of this might be like the Dave Matthews Band, right? Have
Okay.
you heard of them? Okay.
Yes.
Have you heard of Fish?
No.
All right. Well, then I'm only showing how old I am here. Anyway, this is improvisational music, and jazz is improvisational music, right?
Yes.
Right. So Western musicians who play improvisational music are not confined to a raga. So they might explore tones and so on that is outside of the original raga. And for my dad, this meant that they were not as adept as the Indian
Mm.
musicians who had to be creative
Yes.
within the confines of the raga. Whereas a jazz musician or Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, and you should Google him after we get off the phone,
I will.
because I'm president of the Grateful Dead Studies Association, is
See.
that their creativity was not bound, and therefore it wasn't as disciplined. So if we return to the Indian philosophical speculation, right, is that you're doing it within the confines of the Vedic box
Understood.
in some
Yes.
way,
In
right?
some way.
Whether or not it's merely in name only,
Okay.
but you still had to say that you didn't come up with this idea
Yeah.
yourself, right? Like
It's the.
whereas right, or the other example that I like to use is that Indian thinkers always have to footnote.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yes. So do you think the shift in from classical Indian philosophy to contemporary Indian philosophy
Oh, yeah.
do you think like historically was that a factor of like Western influence or is that
Yes.
just okay.
Audience.
Okay, I see.
I think
Okay.
A, audience, B, Western influence. And by Western influence, it's ironic, right? It's colonial approved education in English
Yes.
for the sake of either the East India Company, right?
Hmm.
Or for later on, really for the kind of glory of the the English Empire, right? When the East India Company was no more, but still in 1937,
Yes.
right? What have you, right? What do you think of that? Right? And I should say, and I'm going to damn all these people because, in fact, I'm very conservative, right? Is that contemporary Indian philosophers or contemporary Indian philosophy, which began, with the British, shall we say,
Okay.
like even you could even say Ram Mohan Roy is sort of like that, is that culminates in a really sad, miserable way with Deepak Chopra,
Okay.
right?
I'm not familiar with
But
either of
you've
those
heard of
people.
Deepak Chopra, right? You've
I
heard of Deepak
have,
Chopra,
yes.
right? He's like some new age guru guy who makes a lot of money and has
Yes.
been now linked to the Epstein files. But
Really.
yeah, these are all, people who are just selling to an audience,
I see.
right? Like, then it's a different thing. Whereas in the Indian philosophical world, there is no audience to sell to. It's very esoteric. You have to know Sanskrit and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, this is also slightly tangential, but
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. These are great questions. You're very good at this.
thank you, thank you. It's my first time. But do you think so? Something I've studied just like in class, for example, as a part of some small projects that we've done, but that sort of American tradition of taking a lot of Indian concepts, like the whole fad about yoga, for example. Do you think that is also in line with sort of this colonial era reinterpretation that you're talking about? Is that the same sort of line of thinking of how Western like world has basically reinterpreted and handpicked what they think is, you know,
Well,
interesting?
right. So this is a little bit more complicated, right?
Okay.
And really the kind of interest and curiosity in India, but in Asia is partly a product of British colonization. And I say this because Thoreau and Emerson,
Hmm.
American transcendentalism, is heavily influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism
Yes.
because really for a very simple reason is that somebody sent Thoreau a box of books from England and it had some Hindu and Buddhist texts in it. And so the question is that was this a parallel development or were they influenced by it or did they find confirmation in it? So the jury is out, but for sure they
Okay.
use some of that language, right?
Yes.
And American transcendentalism continues in different ways with different kinds of American spiritualism, with different ideas about capitalism and the West and spiritualism and the so-called mystical East.
Mm.
So all kinds of stereotypes about the Orient and Orientalism, if you're familiar with Edward Said, the author, who wrote the great book Orientalism, about the construction of the so-called Orient in the Western imagination. So I think that these sorts of things have led to more interest in Asia, shall we say.
Yes.
Remember too that America had I mean there's a labor shortage, so you have a Chinese immigrant population working on the railroads, and you had Japanese populations that were eventually interned, right? And
Hmm.
you also had Sikh and Punjabi populations in California. If you go to Stockton,
Yes.
you've got California Indians who've been there for 200 years, right? In some way or other. And then, of course, in World War II, you have all kinds of explorations of the so-called Orient by Americans, and you have a fascination with Buddhism
Mm.
as a result too. And then, of course, you have the Korean War, which and Vietnam War, which also continues this curiosity about Buddhism and about the so-called Orient, right? And within this fold, you have yoga emerges, and and in this connection, Swami Vivekananda, who I'm sure you've heard of,
Yes.
who came to America in the late 19th century,
Yeah.
he came in order to propagate something. He was a really good salesman. And he did not, he wasn't dressed as a Swamiji in India. But when he came to area in America, he filled the stereotype that rich American women wanted. They wanted this stereotype. And it goes along with the stereotype of Western materialism and Indian or Asian or Oriental mysticism and spirituality.
Mm.
So he fit the bill, right? I don't
Right.
want to trash Vivekananda, but he fit the bill. Prior to coming to America, he was not such a guru or a swami, but he
Mm.
became one. And he, in his market, he exploited or he happily embraced, one should say. And so I think that, Rohan, when you said that you were speaking earlier in the way that you asked your question, you were saying and thinking about kind of the Western curiosity and appropriation, right? But I think that the relationship is mutual. You have the curiosity but you also have the realization by some smart Indians
Yeah,
about what niche needs to be filled.
sure.
In the same way that so many Indian immigrants in the last 60, 65 years came to America because they found that there was a niche there that could be not exploited, but that needed to be filled, like doctors in rural places in America, right? And they brought something, a skill.
Yeah,
And so if there was a kind of a lacuna in spirituality in America, and people saw this and jumped in when they saw the space. Swami Vivekananda in the 19th century, but of course in the 20th century, we have Prabhupada from Hare Krishna and all of the many, many, many gurus who came from India in the late 60s and 70s, 80s, and still are coming now.
yeah, certainly. Yeah. So I want to pivot now. You quickly mentioned when you were talking about your background about how you began to question, your knowledge or your experience, and I want you just to sort of unpack that a little bit. What exactly do you mean by questioning your knowledge?
Well, I think that let's just say in a kind of abstract way,
Hmm.
that there are different things that you can do or different places you can find yourself in um, that you're not sure what's real anymore,
Okay.
right? And once you enter that sort of space, call it like a matrix sort of space, if you're familiar with that film.
Yes.
If you enter, like, I should say it like this, it'll sound kind of far out. Once you enter the matrix, once you enter the matrix, then it it's impossible not to question the validity of things that you experience or you see, right? And there's certainly different kinds of things that people have done and do and continue to do to enhance that, right? So I'll give you an example, right? So a classic example is that let's say you have two people who are drinking alcohol, right? And they both see something. Let's say they see somebody rob somebody. And then when they're asked to bear witness to
Mm,
this, because their alcohol has changed their perception, they have different interpretations about what happened, what color shirt that person was wearing, or what have you. And if that happens, then they ought to question their cognitive, like the validity of their cognitions. So they could say, well, this happened because I was, affected in some way by this substance, right? But if we take this in a kind of broader sense,
yeah.
right? Once you think about Plato and the cave allegory, right? Yes?
Yes.
Right. Then, how do you know what if you're seeing the shadows or if there's something real behind you?
Sure.
Right. And even if you turn around and look, is that a shadow or is that the real?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that there are certainly different kinds of intellectual exercises. But I think something that I wrote about recently is that I said that I wrote about it in a different way. Is I wrote that 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 growing up in New York, where I grew up, there were only five or six Indian families for 50 square miles, right? Which is quite the opposite of Silicon Valley,
Hmm.
where there might be only five or six Caucasian families for
Yeah.
50 or 60. And and I remember I would experience the world in the way that my as you know how Indians say this, like my American friends, right? What they were up to. And then I would enter my own house and it was a different world, following different rules, right? Certainly different ethical rules for sure.
Sure.
And it was both confusing and invigorating. Which one was real? Which one was normative?
Sure.
Right? And I think that going between cultures this way made me recognize the construction of cultures, the construction of perspectives, right? And question those,
Mm.
right? Once you recognize that they're human constructions, then you doubt their validity. And once you question all their validities, so to speak, then you end up being a philosopher.
Sure. Um, as a follow-up, do you think, I guess, what specifically do you think catalyzes this reaction to make you question what is real or not real? Like, is it purely observational or is it some sort of emotional response?
Oh, that's funny. It's observational, but now I this is kind of dangerous to talk about this here and for your audience. Okay, so I'm going to first say
Okay,
that I condone this. Okay, but things like psychedelic drugs have a huge impact.
okay, okay. And so, like, in my opinion, or at least my layman sort of perspective would be drugs like that or whatever other substance you could think of, they seem to have like a biological effect on a human. Like, is that the sole extent of our experience, or is there something like beyond that, like that is maybe unchanged by these drugs, if that makes sense?
Not entirely. So you're saying that you take some substance and there's going to be some effect on neurotransmitters, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're saying, is there something more than that?
Yeah, I guess does our experience live outside just our like biological brain?
Okay. Yeah. So this is getting to the questions about consciousness. All right. And about consciousness and cognition. And and whether or not you can, as I like to joke, can you like remove your consciousness from your head,
Hmm.
like a mango pit? Or something smaller, maybe like a pit of a date, let's say, right? Right. And I think that these are, of course, philosophical speculations, which I'm conscious of.
Yes.
Right. And I think that so to think about consciousness is that I think that consciousness is an interesting concept with no I mean it's like I always think of it, people think that there is a consciousness, they think it has, the word ontology, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so people think that there's an ontology to it, that you can find it, right? But really, what you can only do, there are some people who claim to that we have them, and really, what the only way they claim to have or their proof is based on some kind of metrics, right? So you hook some electrical signal will occur, and you have some way of recording it, and if there's some movement in the brain, they'll say, like, that's where consciousness is, right? But this is all speculative.
Sure.
100% speculative, right? And I find it's fascinating. I wrote about this someplace. Remember, I gave a talk about this. Is that things like the id and the ego and the superego, which are, of course, Freudian terms,
Sure.
that everyone knows they're Freudian terms. No one looks around like, "Where's your id?" Like, where did I see it behind your ear? Nobody does that, right? Right? Because we know that they're humanly constructed concepts to
Yes.
help us understand something. And I think that most people forget that consciousness is also humanly constructed, right? And some of the great thinkers in Hindu philosophy, in the Vaisheshika school, the Sankhya school, the Yoga school, and the Nyaya school, most notably, believe that the Atman, right, which is the self, shall we say,
Hmm.
that consciousness is not intrinsic to the Atman, right? That it's a kind of an organ that is attached to it, but that finally, when you strip away all these things from the Atman is unconscious.
Okay.
How's that? I like that one because then that experience, what is that experience like? Well, if you describe it, then you're still using the cognitive apparati, which
Yes.
are not you, right? They're not you, right? And finally, you are something that is outside of language. It's
Yeah.
all ineffable, right? You can't
Yes.
describe it. And the moment you say, wow, consciousness, it's really nice being me, you can't say that because those are all products of something that's external to you.
Yes. So there's truly like a divide between like the physical body or like the physical reality and some other like unphysical explanation
Right.
of ourself.
Yeah, for those four thinkers, I mean, for those four
Okay.
schools of philosophy. Whereas if you throw Buddhism in there, it gets a little messier, right? Because Buddhism, after all, there's the no self doctrine, and that really only in this kind of and it's very similar to Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta. which is why people from the Dvaita school say that Shankaracharya is a quasi-Buddhist. It's the way that they get back at them. At any rate, so at any rate, Buddhism is a little different. Of course, the final state is ineffable, and there's no one who has
Hmm.
it because there's no self, right? But you have to have that what I call bi-level epistemology. There's two levels of reality. Conventional reality, I can say, "Hi, Rohan, my name is Deepak." Finally, ultimately, there is no Deepak or no Rohan, right?
Mm,
And conventionally, I can say conventionally, as a tool, I can say that there's consciousness, right? But that's a tool. It doesn't mean that it exists,
sure,
right? It's
sure.
a way to talk about something. It's an instrument for conversation, shall we say?
Okay. Do you, maybe this is sort of not within the scope of this talk, but do you have, do you have knowledge about how maybe Western tradition treats consciousness and like physical reality uh, in a similar or different way to how Indian philosophy might approach it?
Oh, right. That's a good question. I think that that it's only a very recent kind of reflection about consciousness
Mm,
in the West, right? Of course, Descartes thought about it, but it's only
yes.
in the last 50 years that we have, the hard problems of consciousness and all these kinds of derivations, right? And linked to science always in some
Mm,
way, weird way. Whereas Indian thinkers have been speculating about cognitive capacities and cognitive organs for, 2,500 years,
mm,
right? And it hasn't been so difficult for them, right? And they imagine these conceptualizations, as I said, as kind of organs. They have the buddhi, you have the manas, and things like that. And these are processors. They process information coming in, and then they send that information to the Atman in some way. Or they are just merely there, and the Atman, accidentally or inadvertently or imagines that they are those things, imagines that they are the equivalent to consciousness. So I think that consciousness reflection is relatively new to the Western world,
okay.
right? Whereas I think that consciousness reflection, people have been doing that for quite some time in the Indian context, at least for 2,400 years, right? That doesn't make one better than the other, right? It's just the time wasn't ripe for that kind of reflection in the West, shall we say. And in the same way, and this is slightly different, right? But it's a similar kind of thing to think about, is that in the mid to late 60s, or really early mid late 60s, when psychedelics were first kind of in taking hold at Harvard, right? And elsewhere, that the states of consciousness that were achieved in the consumption of psychedelic drugs had no parallels at all in the context of Western psychology or Western philosophy. And so people like Leary and others looked towards Buddhism and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which have explicit characterizations of levels and stages of consciousness that adherents achieve en route to enlightenment. That seemed to these people who are consuming these psychedelics seemed to parallel the phases one went through on psychedelic drugs, right? So that's another way to say that speculations about consciousness and stages of consciousness were not there in the
Mm.
Western context as much as they were very rich. I mean, it's a very rich history in Buddhism and in yoga. And by yoga, I mean Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, not Lululemon gymnastic twisting.
So, one follow-up. You said uh, sort of these people who were using these substances speculated that the Indian traditions or Buddhist traditions that were outlined sort of mirrored their own experiences. Um,
Uh-huh.
to what extent do you find that to be like a correct analogy or a correct parallel?
Right, that's funny. There's a lot of people who are working on that. I was just at a conference in Harvard, and there was a few people there who are thinking about this very issue, seeing if they can do a correlation, right?
Okay.
I think that so to answer that, if I was to answer there's a direct correlation, right? Would give credence to the belief that psychedelic drugs can give you a mystical experience, right?
Sure.
And if I deny that, right, then I'm saying that they can't give you mystical experience, right? So I think that the jury is out on that one, right?
Okay.
Right. The jury is certainly out on that one. So I'm not going to tell you that they are a direct correlation, but I would say as an instrument that thinking about some of those levels of consciousness in Indian philosophical texts can give you the language to
Hmm.
think about what that experience might be when you're on psychedelics. Let me give you an example, okay? Is that there's a interesting psychedelic substance called 5-MeO-DMT, okay? And it's found in some toads, which sometimes people refer to as like licking the toad, but there's other stuff that's in the toad, okay? So it's not just licking the toad, right? But so 5-MeO-DMT, when vaped or when inhaled and smoked, very quickly it acts only for half an hour, 45 minutes at most. Um, and it gives one the sensation that one has no self anymore, right? Which is odd to say. You can only describe it going in and emerging. When you're in it, you don't have a self. You can't really explain what that is. You can only explain it as you get out of it or as you enter it, right? As you're entering it, you feel, well, I'm losing my sense of self. And then you're in this space that might be timeless and that you can't really describe or explain, even though I'm trying to explain it now. And then when you emerge from it, you start recognizing that you have a self and a body and what have you. Okay. And this, I think, is a very useful way to think about what the experience of a temporary nirvana might be like.
Mm.
What is it like to have a no self experience? After all, the Buddhists believe in the doctrine of anatman, no self doctrine. And conventionally, we can talk about it, right? And I could tell you, Rohan, that you don't have a self. And you'll say, yeah, I don't have a self, but there's something philosophically funny about that, right? Unless you have your hands up and you say, I don't have a self, right? That's silly, right? But thinking about it in these kind of it would, taking 5-MeO and then reading about, say, Yogacara Buddhism, let's say, right? Or reading about these schools of Nyaya and Vaisheshika, that it might help you understand what you went through or what you
Mm.
experienced in a way that Western philosophical tests don't provide that for you at all.
Yeah, totally makes sense. One more topic I wanted to discuss is you brought up a lot of bands and pop culture references. I wanted to ask, how does that tie into your field of work?
That's a great question. Um, and I think that I just wrote a piece on this that's going to appear sometime this summer
Okay,
about play, right? Playing, right? So
okay.
playing like children playing, right? And I think that and this ties in with my understanding of the utility and value of liberal arts education.
Hmm.
Okay, is I think that and have you read Hermann Hesse, The Glass Bead Game? Make a note of that.
I will.
Yeah. So it's really, it won a Nobel Prize actually in 1946, right?
Okay.
In literature. Hermann Hesse, Hesse. Um, so that said, I think that I know that you're interviewing me in the context of philosophy, right? And I am you could say that I'm trained in Indian philosophy. You could say that I do Hindu theology. You could say that I do cultural theory. You could say that if you saw my CV, I've done a lot of different things. I curated the Cleveland Museum of Art. I culturally consulted for Netflix, Amazon, Mattel with Thomas the Train, Coco Melon, right? I have done a lot of different things. And now I'm working on psychedelics and up until really last week, I had an affiliation with Harvard Law School. I don't, the affiliation is over because that grant money is gone. So I wear a lot of different hats. And um, I think that the parallel between play and intellectual reflection is about um, improvisation, right? Not so much Indian classical music, but Western jam band improvisation, right? So what makes that kind of improvisation is about exploration. It's about drawing connections that you didn't see before, about sometimes very disparate things, right? And relishing in these new connections, relishing in the beauty of the new construction that you're making and moving on towards another one, let's say, right? And so, you know, I could play the philosopher in this context. I was in the news yesterday playing the kind of philosopher cultural theorist yesterday on TV, right? I wear lots of different hats, right? And so I think that the improvisational music I listen to is a good example of the kind of play that Hermann Hesse envisioned in the Glass Bead game, and the kind of play that I engage in in everything that I do,
Sure.
right? And the kind of play that I think ought to continue to be maintained in liberal arts colleges. I
Mm,
think everybody plays. Everybody makes cool connections for the sake of making them. Everybody gets adept at language games to kind of throw some Wittgenstein in there. And the play in a language game is to put sentences way together in a new way and use grammar, but still following a particular grammar. So I don't think this is an elitist thing, right? The Glass Bead game, people accuse of it being elitist. You should read the book. But I think that when people uh, get out of their workplace, let's say they're working in a factory or they're doing something that has been typically understood as not very intellectual by intellectuals, of course. And they'll be engaging in some play whether it's about machines at work, let's say, or they might have as a side curiosity thinking about football or baseball or that what is that thing called when people do a sheet like they predict what the games are going to be like? There's some word that people use for this.
like bracket?
Fantasy football,
Yeah,
fantasy football, fantasy football. Fantasy football is about playing. And it's about playing once you have some knowledge and some parameters,
sure.
football thing, right? So like these people excel in this and they have these statistics and then they play, right? So play doesn't have to be philosophical.
Mm,
It doesn't it's when people play like that, then not only do they enjoy life more, but it's part of the creation of beauty in the universe, I think,
mm,
right? And so improvisational music that I listen to is about creating beauty like this,
hmm.
right? Creating beauty like this. And if you attend one of these kinds of shows, of course, there might be people there on psychedelic drugs, which adds to the whole phenomena.
Yeah.
But you'll see there that people are creative. They're less restricted in the way that they behave, in the way that they act, in the way that they judge others. So you go to one of these concerts and it's a little bit like a carnival. People dress in different ways, people behave in different ways. There are different coded games that people play. And the improvisational music encourages that.
Hmm.
And if the musicians are any good, then there's something incredible about watching people play music together, right? And if you watch a band of some people, they've been playing together for 40 years, like the level of play, the edges of creativity that they're able to kind of break, or the boundaries of creativity is unbelievable,
Mm.
right? And so I think that these all tie together very nicely. At least they do in my mind. And I'm just being playful.
Great. So totally makes sense. I think this idea of beauty is definitely something, and like how to construct it is definitely something I'm sort of realizing now, especially in a lot of my own like sort of humanities courses and whatnot. But Anyways, the last topic I wanted to touch upon was sort of concerning the youth. So
Youth.
you talked a lot about your own education experience.
Yeah.
I was wondering how if how you like would necessarily maybe encourage philosophy education for younger people, how maybe they can engage with these types of questions.
So I think that you should have no fear. I think having no fear is key, right? And the fear is the no fear to study something that is outside of the STEM context. But most importantly, you should have no fear in questioning your beliefs.
Mm,
You should be able to question your presuppositions. And um, I'll give you an example, right? So when I have students, when I teach my Indian philosophy class, my goal, if you take a look at I wrote a blog for the American Philosophical Association. So if you look at my name, APA blog, it'll there's a short piece that I wrote about what it's like to teach Indian philosophy and why I teach Indian philosophy. Okay. And I teach Indian philosophy and I teach in the university and I function in the universe. I mean, really, this is kind of the whole kit and caboodle here.
yeah.
My job is to get people to question their presuppositions, what their basic beliefs are. And I find that when I teach Indian philosophy, not everybody is willing to question them.
Mm,
And if they don't question them, then the class is useless, right? Then they don't learn anything.
sure.
It's like a bit like being constrained to vocational stuff. And to put it in slightly different terms, is that if they are not willing to question their presuppositions, then they don't want to play. So I think that for people who want to study philosophy, what they need, and I've argued this is all tying together very nicely, Rohan, thanks. That I really like I'm really thanks for your questions. It really is making me see what I've done this year,
Mm,
the stuff that I've done this year, in the last year, is that what I think people should aim for, and what is necessary for good philosophy is what I call epistemic humility. And I think epistemic arrogance is the opposite of that. And epistemic arrogance is overconfidence in your epistemic foundations and your knowledge.
mm,
Whereas epistemic humility is being open to the possibility of being wrong.
yes.
I think that is the most important thing when you certainly take Indian philosophy with me. But when you take any class in the humanities and social sciences, is that you should be open to the learning. And open learning means recognizing that something that you believed may be wrong or may not be a very useful way to think about something. And I think to enter into the humanities and social sciences is risky and takes a tremendous amount of courage because a good student of the social sciences and humanities will be epistemically humble. And being
Sure.
epistemically humble means being open and thinking that you may not be right.
Sure. So this idea of epistemic humility actually, I do debate. I'm not sure if I mentioned this. So we have this concept of epistemic modesty and epistemic confidence. So
Uh,
I'm very grateful like for activities like debate for really introducing like a lot of high schoolers to these types of topics. And I certainly hope in the future it grows. One last question I had. You mentioned this habit of, questioning beliefs. Do you think sort of are there any modern or like contemporary factors that particularly make that important or change the way that you do
Sure.
that?
100%. I think that, and I'm kind of walking out on thin ice here, okay,
Sure.
is that I think that the current situation that America is in is because people don't have epistemic humility.
Mm,
And I think that anytime there's a crack in the system, somebody with epistemic arrogance will try and patch that crack to
mm,
continue this delusion of epistemic certainty. Case in point. is that day before yesterday, the President of the United States posted an image of himself looking like Jesus Christ. And then when he recognizes that it was going to problematize his base, he gaslit everybody and he said that he thought he was a doctor. And Frank Graham, who I was just asked to write about today, this afternoon for the Huffington Post, is that he's a leading religious figure in the MAGA Christian world. And he too defended and said that yes, yes, Trump would never do such a thing. He really was trying to look like a doctor,
Mm,
right? And I think that that for a minute, for just a minute, people in the MAGA world had their epistemic certainty kind of slightly
mhm.
jarred. Like there was a slight tremor, shall we say, fractured ever so slightly. And and he jumped in and gaslit them with his epistemic arrogance. So I think that this particular moment is critical. And then I really hate to throw this one in there, but it's true, is that the data available in the web and the internet confuses people that that they are in fact epistemically authoritative, when in fact all they have is access to data.
Mm.
Access to data does should not give you epistemic confidence.
Yes,
And I don't know how to address that one other than this, but those are two huge problems.
excellent. Thank you. That yeah, I think the modern world poses many new challenges, and I think coming to the same foundation of sort of rigorous questioning is the only way we can truly, you know, make it out with a better society. Um,
Yep.
s- so I think I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I think that about wraps up our episode. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for your time, and I certainly learned a lot and enjoyed this session, and I'm sure our audience did as well.